So, what happens when a new belief system, a new community is threatened from the inside? In this explainer, we're going to dive into this really fascinating ancient letter that was written to a church in the middle of a crisis. And we'll see what it can teach us about navigating our own world, which is just full of competing ideas.
Okay, let's get right into it. We're going to play detective a little bit and investigate this mysterious and pretty dangerous teaching that was threatening to completely throw a young Christian community off track in a city called Colossae.
First things first, we gotta set the scene. And I want you to forget any image you have of massive stone cathedrals. The church in Colossae, it was something way more intimate, and because of that, way more vulnerable.
I mean, this was their reality, right? It was a close-knit group, probably meeting in someone's living room, just trying to figure out how to live out this new faith together. But that intimacy, well, it also made them a perfect target for a really confusing teaching that was starting to creep in and twist what they believed. Okay, so what was this dangerous philosophy exactly? Scholars have pored over this for years, kind of like detectives on a cold case, and the answer they've come up with, it's probably not what you'd first expect. So, through some really careful work, they've crossed a few of the old theories off the list. For instance, it wasn't Gnosticism. That whole movement popped up way later, and it probably wasn't a formal Greek school of thought like Stoicism or something. The evidence for that is just really thin. The real problem, it turns out, was something a lot messier. And this is where most scholars have landed today. The key concept is syncretism. This wasn't some single, tidy heresy. Oh no. It was a spiritual Frankenstein's monster, a hybrid created by mixing and matching bits and pieces of totally different beliefs.
And scholar Clint Arnold, whose view is pretty much the standard now, he just nails it. He calls it this dangerous cocktail of local folk religion, some regional Jewish traditions, and Christianity, all swirled together. And in the eyes of the Apostle Paul, this was a huge, huge compromise.
You know, to put it in our terms, it's kind of like trying to mix your faith with, I don't know, astrology or tarot cards, blending folk magic into your worship. This wasn't just some high-minded intellectual debate. This was people dragging pagan practices into their brand new faith, and it was causing a whole lot of confusion.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. How does the Apostle Paul respond to all this? Well, he doesn't just come out swinging, attacking the philosophy head-on. No, his strategy is much smarter, much more foundational. See, before he even touches the problem, he works to strengthen their foundation. He reminds them of who they are and whose they are, because he knows that is the real key to helping them resist all these confusing ideas swirling around them. And just look at the language he uses right out of the gate. He calls his coworker Timothy our brother. He calls the Colossians faithful brothers. He calls God our Father. He's building this framework of what you could call a fictive kinship, basically framing everyone, himself included, as one big, tight-knit family.
All right, so he's established that they're a family, and this is where his response gets even more targeted. He offers up a prayer that is basically a direct antidote counterpunch to every single part of the false teaching.
I mean, think about it. This false teaching was pulling them every which way. It was all based on human ideas. It was pushing all these complicated rules about food. It was obsessed with angels and special visions. And ultimately, it was just making people proud and arrogant, not grounding them in Christ. And Paul's prayer? Man, it's a point-by-point takedown of all of that. He doesn't pray for mystical experiences or secret knowledge. He prays that they would know God's will, that they'd be strengthened by His power, that their lives would produce good things, and that they would grow in real, practical holiness. It's so grounded. And all of this builds to what is, honestly, the absolute climax of his opening argument. He reminds them of the single most important event, the one thing that defines their entire reality. And here's the crucial point, right? Paul knows that the best defense against a bad idea isn't just a better argument. It's a crystal clear understanding of a world-altering truth that they seem to be forgetting. This is it. This is the heart of his entire response. He reminds them, hey, you've already been moved. You've been rescued from the kingdom of darkness and literally transferred, replanted into the kingdom of light. Your entire address has changed. I mean, just imagine being rescued from the worst job you have ever had and being instantly transferred to your absolute dream job. That's the scale of change he's talking about. It's a total switch in your status, your location, your identity, And when you realize that, add in a little folk magic or some human tradition on top of it, it's not just unnecessary, it's completely irrelevant.
And that really leaves us with a question for our own lives, doesn't it? When you're faced with 1,000 competing voices, 1,000 different ideas, maybe the best response isn't to try and argue with every single one. Maybe it's just to get really, really clear on who you are and where you truly belong.